Sandy, I want to move on to our next question this evening, which comes from Jennifer Ba. Jennifer.
How will the government increase the representation of black people in positions of decision-making and influence?
Thank you. Philippa Whitford, only one SNP MP or MSP comes from an ethnic minority background. What are you doing about that?
Well, you know, it just continues, doesn't it? It's really relentless at this point. George Floyd's death still been exploited nearly a month later. As you can see, you know, I made a video last year sometime titled, "What the fuck are they doing to Scotland?" or words to that effect. Which was basically me watching through some women-only conference at Holyrood, with the premise being centred around trying to encourage more women into politics. What became clear, as that shit show went on, however, was that the vast majority of them were actually feminists. And the proverbial feminist narratives were alive and well, and the same buzzwords were trotted out as each speaker had their turn. And it started to become rather apparent that it really wasn't about getting more women into Parliament at all, but rather a certain type of women, so to speak. You know, women who at the very least agreed in part with the feminist worldview, or, preferably, a full-blown feminist. And the same appears to be true here. You know, it's like they're laying the groundwork, setting the tone even. Literally every conversation on the lack of representation, regardless of who or where it comes from, seems to swiftly descend into the predictable narratives surrounding structural buzzwords and systemic barriers, disparities and oppression, racism and microaggressions, etc. And what influence would a black man in that parliament even have if he didn't share the same views as those already in there? What decision would he get away with making if his views were opposed by those already in there? And speaking of which, that girl or woman danced around the point a little there, did she not? By referring to decision-making and influence, instead of just referring to power, which is really what it all boils down to. Power. And they're laying the groundwork currently for any anti-racist expert out there, any social justice twat, or really any far lefty or fringe lefty in general, to throw their hat into the ring. Anyway.
Well, I think there's a recognition, obviously, after what happened with George Floyd, what has come from it through the Black Lives Matters campaign, is I think there is finally a recognition to face up to Scotland's history, but also then to actually take action around that.
Bearing in mind that the rhetoric and demands being espoused currently from Black Lives Matter come fresh off the back of George Floyd's death. A death that occurred in America, a death that had fuck all to do with racism, a death that had nothing to do with our country, nor our parliament. Yet for some strange reason, the false narrative that surrounds his death seems to be playing a pivotal role in influencing every conversation and every decision in relation to the direction of our country going forward. It's almost as if these wankers are knowingly using the death of George Floyd to pursue their own goals. Well, ain't that something? That's true progression from the bold and brave feminists.
You know, I come from a background, as you said earlier, as a woman surgeon, a breast cancer surgeon. When I was at medical school, and that might seem like before the deluge, but it wasn't actually, I was told women couldn't do surgery.
Oh, I bet you were.
You know, I had a fight all of my career to try and make it through. And we actually see the same thing for women. We see it even worse for people from a BAME background.
Or they get told that they can't go into politics. You're going to attribute some alleged incident that occurred to you when you were younger, and you're going to compare that to why there isn't brown people in Parliament. Okay, got ya.
People with disability. And we actually have to get serious in the election. There's a Scottish election next year, so all the parties can look at how are they actually going to invite people forward. If you go to a hustings and it's 4 men in grey suits, no one of colour, no women, no one with disability, that tells you that's not for me. I'm not considered part of that.
Fuck, man. You know, I've heard it all now, eh? That's not for me. That's what it tells you, apparently. You're not considered part of that. In a country that's overwhelmingly white, it's not unusual to see whites in leadership roles. So provided your political views were aligned, I really fail to see what the problem would be at said hustings event. If anything, you're just giving legitimacy, as they all do, to the calls for positive discrimination to be brought forward, and for the introduction of minority-only shortlists to be incorporated alongside their women-only shortlists. So progressive. So inclusive. Sticking it to the oppressor, am I right? And you know, this whole conversation could be derailed so easily by bringing up the demographic makeup of the country, pointing out the mathematics or incorporating mathematics alongside it. You know, that would be enough to throw this pandering bullfrog off our stride. But instead of that, they all sit there in the stereotypical circle jerk and pretend that this is really a serious issue that needs urgent attention. And only they have the progressive powers to be able to save the day. That's something.
You hold your branch meetings in a pub. You're excluding people of the Muslim faith. So, you know, sometimes it's things...
Well, I have never thought of it that way. Truly an intellectual big brain powerhouse.
We just haven't thought about, but we actually need to look at the lists we have, the selection process we have, to try to actually invite the people in Scotland, regardless of where their parents or their grandparents came from. They are part of this country and they should be represented in that parliament.
You know, I'm sure you've heard before now the quote from Nicola Thinlips, where she says to a bunch of children at a Q&A, that whether in fact you've lived here for 6 months, or if your family's been here for generations, as far as she's concerned, you're Scottish. Where you come from doesn't matter. And it clearly does. Because if everybody was just as Scottish as each other, and we were all one, then why is it that you lot especially, but progressives in general, lefties in general, or minorities, regardless, they consistently claim that minorities need to see themselves in leadership positions, they need to be quote-unquote represented. Surely, if we were all one, then that shouldn't be an issue. Yet for a group of wankers who try so desperately hard to pretend race and in-group preference are merely social constructs, you don't have sail close to the wind when it comes to your justification. And on a separate note, the Parliament is mainly white. Yeah, I don't feel represented and never have. There is literally nobody in there that speaks for the well-being of native Scots. The fact that the majority of them who happen to be white isn't really enough for me to feel represented. Which begs the question, in a sense, is it, that you really mean by representation? It's not a case of having any old black or Muslim in there for the sake of being there. Because if they don't prioritise their communities, if they don't spend most of their time focusing on their respective communities, then surely said communities in question wouldn't feel like they were actually represented. Just food for thought.
So time for BAME only shortlists, focus on there?
Well, whether it's BAME only, but I think you need to be making sure that you are having shortlists where you're representing the groups that are not sufficiently represented, whether that's disability, BAME, or still women. I mean, women are 52% of the population. We still don't have half the MSPs. So
there it is. It's still disingenuous. It's remarkable because I've heard them all on several occasions refer to at least 50-50 for women. And there's certain sectors out there that pay well, where they want, if it's a women-dominated sector, it gets to stay that way. But if it's a male-dominated one, they want women in there. You know, very good picking and choosing. But on paper, the percentage of women in the country does not match the percentage in Parliament, and that somehow indicates the rampant inequality that they speak of. But going by that logic, the same justification can, and most definitely will be used in the future, in the years ahead, as whites become smaller and smaller, percentage-wise, in this country. There will need to be more BME, BEME politicians put into positions of power to represent what it says on paper. Funny how that works.
You can look at how you're going to put those shortlists together, and I think that's a challenge to all of the parties that are in Holyrood, and indeed Westminster.
Ian Gray, you were leader of the Scottish Labour Party in Scotland for 3 years. What did you do about this?
Well, the first thing to say is that the Labour group in Holyrood has always been 50-50 gender balanced, because right from the very first Holyrood election, we had a mechanism which ensured that half of our candidates in the winnable seats or the winnable places on the list were women. And it was a painful process, but we stuck to it.
Oh, you're so brave,
and as a result, at each election, our group has been 50-50.
Okay, but Parliament this is a question about race.
Well,
this is a question about race.
Let me get to it. The Parliament hasn't been 50-50 because it's taken other parties much longer to take those kind of measures with regard to women. So the issue for us then became a representation of black and minority ethnic
Well, it wasn't an
candidates.
either or. You could have done both.
And what we did was to do exactly both. So when I was leader, our selection processes, where we selected for the party list, did use positive discrimination both for women and for black and minority ethnic candidates.
Look where that got you, Paul. So it begs the question again. Was it that there wasn't that many BAME candidates standing for your party? Or is it that your party itself is racist? Which one is it? I wonder if you're going to tell us. I really wonder. Nah.
And indeed, our current list system has just been thrown out or delayed by our executive committee because it failed to do that to their satisfaction.
Let me guess, there wasn't enough blanks on it, yeah?
So we do have to do that. But I have to say to you, in all honesty, that it's proven much more difficult to be successful with black and minority ethnic candidates than it was with women. And so we have not particularly contributed to Holyrood's record, which is an appalling one, when it comes to MSPs from those backgrounds. So that's what I did, that's what we're doing. But we have to find ways of doing more because it isn't working. It really isn't working.
Sometimes you have to take a step back and second guess yourself. Are you witnessing another example of a progressive circle jerk? Or is this the actions and the words of a man who is blatantly delusional? It's really hard to tell sometimes. Reality does appear to go over their heads. In a country that made up 98% white in 2001 and 96% white in 2011, stood to reason, stands to reason even now, that the percentage of BAME people in the country is small. It would be even smaller if we're looking at those who would be standing for election. But for some strange reason, despite the fact that the population of these people is rather small in comparison to the majority, for some strange reason, because there's none of them or not enough of them in Parliament, that indicates something wrong with the country. So their solution is to just force them in there. Maybe I've got a better solution for you. Maybe that's part of the bigger picture, the bigger plan. Is that why we are constantly being diluted as a population with more of these people every single year via immigration? You want more of these people in here? And what for?
Jennifer, what do you think? You asked the question.
I think there's a real worry within the black and minority ethnic communities that this is a flavour of the month. So there'll be some tokenism that happens right now. It'll be discussed a lot. You'll see a lot of Facebook posts and Twitter posts. But then within a few weeks, things will all die down and we'll be in the exact same position that we're in now.
Oh, well, you're concerned that your requests and your demands could potentially be forgotten about in a few weeks. And you're worried that this could be one of those flavour of the month things. You know, those requests and those demands that came about by exploiting the false narrative of a man who died in America. So you don't see anything wrong with using the momentum in the weeks that followed his death to justify your demands, but you do see something wrong with the idea of people only humouring your demands for a couple of weeks. Ain't that something?
I remember my mum in the 70s having these conversations. So I think it's really worrying. And I would start from the position of consulting with the communities, consulting with the African community, consulting with different Asian communities, and finding out what are the barriers, what can we do to move forward, and see how this could be framed a little bit differently.
Thank you. Nicola.
Work in health planning, and whenever we have a community or a demographic that isn't engaging with a particular thing we're trying to promote, we always presume that's our fault, and we need to go back out, as Jennifer's just said, and find out what those barriers are and remove them. And until the parties accept that it's their fault and they need to remove the barriers, those barriers will stay in place.
Andrew.
Yeah, I was really moved by Anis Sarwar's speech that he gave in Holyrood recently. I think it was just earlier this week, when he mentioned, I think it was just 4 black and minority ethnic MSPs have been elected in Scotland. But
I was shocking, isn't it, Paul?
Looking at some stats, I think it's about 4% of Scotland's population. It comes from an ethnic minority.
How can you be moved by a speech which consisted of complaining that there was too many Scottish people in positions of power, all the while the same speech ignored the demographic reality of the country, which you yourself just brought up? Oh my days, man, I swear it's all these people.
And just 1% of those are in the police force. You know, that's the representation of that number. Just 1.8% is in our civil service. At my university at Edinburgh, we have very little. You know, I'm in the School of Divinity, which is a much wider range. But I think to answer the question, It was specifically about what can Scotland do to put people into these official positions. And it's clearly that there's something that needs to be accelerated. You know,
the minute you go down the route of positive discrimination or anything of the sort, you immediately make things unequal. Now, in theory, we're supposed to live in a meritocracy, but if you're looking at the world through a racial lens, which the majority of these people do, then it doesn't seem as though the meritocracy in question is really that fair. Maybe it's even racist, systemically and structurally. If there was 100 people applying for a job, and 98 of them are white, and 2 of them are BAME individuals, then it stands to reason that the likelihood of one of the 2 BAME individuals bagging the job is very unlikely if we're looking at it from the perspective of 98 versus 2. When in reality, it is 100 people competing for the same job, and the likelihood of the person walking away with it will be white, purely for the fact there's 98 of them. But again, that 98 are competing against each other. These people that claim that they're post-racial and progressive and anti-racist, they can't help but see the world through a racial lens. And that's part of the problem here. I mean, I'm not preaching like some civ nut here. I'm not an individualist and I'm not some Sargonite type. But even I can see the wood from the trees. It just seems that these people are incapable of doing so. And I have to question whether or not it's intentional or unintentional. Maybe a bit of both.
Acceptable rates.
Thank you.
But it is a wider issue.
It is. Anna Sarwar was making about university principals, judges, newspaper editors, all white.
In a majority white country. Bear in mind, white people in this case are Scottish. Scottish people making up the bulk of positions of power in Scotland, their homeland. That's a problem.
In Scotland, what message does that send out?
It sends a message that Scotland is still predominantly white. It sends a message, or it's supposed to send a message to Scottish people who are in control of Scotland. It's their country after all. But of course, we have to change everything. We need to bend the rules and modernise and diversify to incorporate and accommodate the people that are being imported in year on year that we didn't ask for in the first place, but still find themselves over here anyway. This is the mess of the politicians, in fairness. It's not the fault of the people that have come over here for the most part. It's politicians doing. Yet these are the same wankers that then sit on stage and talk about ways to rectify the problems they created themselves. I was pissed about anti-racism. I was pissed about systemic inequality, etc. Or unconscious bias. Blaming us for the shit show that they've created.
Population.
So what are you going to change?
And it doesn't. Well, we have to get better at listening. I think there's a lot we do have to change. I am wholly in favour of legislative action. I'd like to...
Of course you are, but you ain't going to resign. You ain't going to stand down and let somebody take your place, are you though? No, of course you're not. Why don't you stand down and let a black communist in? Instead of having to listen to your whining and Patrick Harvey's whining. Let's hear whining from a black for a change. Take the initiative. Stand down.
See parties have to put forward a slate that is that representative of the population.
Well, the population that's majority white that you seem to have a bit of a problem with.
I mean, we have been struggling now. Parliament's over 20 years old. We haven't even managed to make it gender balanced. If anything, we've gone backwards.
Oh, we've gone backwards, you see, because some of the women that they've forced in throughout the years have either resigned or whatnot. And that indicates us going backwards, because it's only progress when their targets are met. And that's fundamentally one of the biggest problems of this whole shit show that is the Scottish Parliament and Scottish politics in general. All these wankers believe the same thing. There really isn't that much of a differing of opinion. And they're all obsessed with meeting targets. They're all obsessed with what they call progression. When in reality, what good is it doing to society? What benefit is it having? It's not benefiting the natives. It's not benefiting the country. Who's it benefiting? Them? Debatable. I'm starting to wonder if it's even going to benefit the people they're importing. What are they doing that's beneficial to this country? Nothing. Absolutely fucking nothing. Peace.